Hello and welcome to In Conversation with WLV Doctoral College. My name's Deborah Curitan and I'm the Research Development Manager at the University of Wolverhampton.
I'm Ben Halligan, I'm Director of the Doctoral College.
We've decided that we're going to talk about selecting examiners, the process of selecting examiners and the role that students play within that. So, Ben, what do you think?
You, as a postgraduate researcher,
Yep.
you may not choose who your external examiner is.
Yep.
However, most supervisors at most universities welcome your input, your suggestion.
Yep.
And in fact, maybe 6-7 months before submission, that conversation could occur. And I think it's a useful conversation because it gets you thinking about who can best examine the thesis and lend something to the work as it evolves by having them engage with your work and hopefully sign it off and pass your work. So I think there are a couple of tips I'd like to suggest.
Yeah.
One is it may be the work itself has yielded a suggestion as to who the external examiner is, so that if you worked very much under the sign of a certain person's ideas, or there's been somebody whose work has been a big influence on your work, maybe that person, if they're still around, would be the ideal examiner for you. And you would think that they may be totally interested in the way that your work's attempted to expand their ideas, they may be quite flattered, they may want to see how people have used some key text that they wrote a few years ago. But that leads me to my second tip in a way, which is just because they're the big name in the area doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually the person to examine you. Because it could well be that they're not flattered at all, but irritated. And it could well be that they are maybe somewhat territorial. If you've developed their ideas in a new way, they may object to that.
Yeah.
So how do we find this out? Because the other thing is, you could have encountered that person at a conference doing a keynote and they seemed affable and jolly, and you talked afterwards and you thought, this is the person to examine my thesis, they seem a very friendly person. But then, in a Jekyll and Hyde moment, they actually turned into an unfriendly person at the point of the viva. So I guess my second tip is to try and find people that have maybe been examined by this individual. And it's not hard to do that, because often if you Google PhD external examiner and the name of this person, you will find that websites of academics or other people in other industries will say, my PhD was from this university, was awarded in this year and was examined by this person.
Yeah.
So you could drop them an email and say, I'm thinking about looking to an external examiner, my thesis is on this subject. I was thinking about Professor X, I know you were examined by them, was that a good experience? And they will probably tell you, it was wonderful, or I never want to see this person in my life again, or So I think the second tip would be to try and find somebody who've had experiences of this person, and find out whether it was, whether it's a good suggestion to make to your supervisors, who by the way, may not go with it anyhow. They may have somebody else in mind.
I think usually it's a bit of a combination of both. But I know as a supervisor, I wouldn't want to appoint somebody that a student was, vehemently opposed to. So I think it has to be a bit of a negotiation between who the student wants and what, as often as supervisors, we might know about those people in terms of their stance, their approach to examining, the way that the student has written compared to the way that they might write. So it's kind of trying to find somebody who's a good match for a lot of factors that are often not always apparent to the student when they're thinking about, I want to be examined by this big professor. There are lots of different underlying things that we need to think about as well.
I guess another underlying thing is your confidence in your work. I mean, if you think that your work is really of a higher standard and the best you can do, you may be absolutely up for getting the global name in your field to be your examiner. And that might lend quite a bit of kudos to your PhD, your research, to be awarded by this person. If you're a bit less confident in your work for one reason or another, you may not want the global superstar turning up, being frustrated at the failings of your work and then causing trouble. You may want someone who's, you know, a bit more kind of up and coming and maybe a bit younger, who perhaps will be a lot more creative and constructive in their criticism and help you overcome what you maybe perceive as issues in order to do corrections and get the thesis awarded. So maybe there's some gradations in respect of your confidence in the work as well.
What do you think about appointing people in your field who have a, we've talked about a doctorate might be looking at a particular subject but through different lenses. How do you feel about appointing somebody who perhaps comes from a different theoretical perspective or has a different viewpoint?
I think, there should in a way be a balance, because you'll have an internal examiner.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a member of staff, you have 2 externals.
Yeah.
So I think that the most universities, the committees that will look at the nominations will take them as a whole. So across these 2 or 3 examiners, how much experience have they had of examining doctorates before? What are their particular backgrounds? Sometimes, say in an interdisciplinary PhD, it may be that you're pulling in 2 different fields of expertise, so you would need examiners, one from each field, and they may not necessarily be that cognizant of the other's field, but you hope that together they have the right combination. So I think in answer to your question, that's okay, but I think you need to have a balance, and it can't be that necessarily you have a thesis and work around theory A and the examiners are entirely from theory B.
Yeah.
So sometimes examiners will pull out, often frustratingly a couple of weeks before the viva. You'll get a message saying something like, "Oh, I've just looked at the thesis and I now realise I'm not the person to examine it." And that can be upsetting for the student because they've prepared themselves for the viva and now it's going to be delayed. But in a way it's better that that should happen, and it's more honest of an examiner that should happen. Although obviously it would have been nice if they'd declined the invitation at the outset, then, as very rarely happens, you wind up with examiners who are not sympathetic to your approach, don't understand the theoretical body of work that you're drawing upon, and so may try and suggest aligning your work to their field. I mean, it rarely happens, but that's why you have quite a complicated approval process to make sure that these are the right people for your particular work.
I think what I was the question I was asking, and that's kind of answered half of it, was sometimes you might be working in a field where there's very little, or there's a small body of evidence. So you're adding a different perspective to that body of evidence, but everybody else who's working in that area is working through a particular lens. And you take a different lens, but you're drawing on that body of people who are working through a critical lens, but you're perhaps looking through a different type of critical lens. And sometimes, if you're doing that, you might be saying you're quoting the examiner's work, but the examiner's work you are saying is weak or invalid because it's looking at using this lens, or it's narrow, it's narrow-sighted because it's not accepting the other lens as part of the equation. And how might is it a good idea to have an examiner whose work you're challenging, or
it depends how I think. I mean, the other thing is, if you have an examiner whose work you've actually engaged with, but before you submit the thesis, it's probably smart to just check what you said about them. Because if you say once again it's another failing on the part of Smith, they may take quite badly to that. If you're talking about, even if you disagree with it, the kind of foundational work that Smith has done, now, in 2019 needs expanding or updating in new directions, then you're opening a constructive dialogue with their work rather than being dismissive of it. I mean, there are some bodies of work that perhaps you need to be dismissive of within the PhD, but then if you're dismissive of it, you shouldn't really be getting an external examiner who's coming from that.
Yeah.
So I think a kind of careful politeness is
Okay.
perhaps necessary. Do you agree?
Yes. And I think sometimes where we've seen people getting resubmissions is often that they've had an examiner who are coming from a particular perspective, and then haven't warmed to the other perspective that the student is coming from, and have asked them to rewrite in terms of the perspective that they come from.
But then, of course, the one of the tasks of the internal examiner is to balance the opinions of the external. So you don't get a subjective response. You actually get two experts in the field who are, balancing each other and keeping a check on each other.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll have people saying, I don't necessarily agree with the way in which you've done this, but I accept it's a very legitimate way of doing it, and it's of a PhD level, so I'm happy to recommend that it's awarded. So yeah.
The other question I was going to ask was about internal examiners. So obviously at Wolverhampton we try to keep an internal examiner as independent from the project as possible. So they're not going to be people who advised on the project, and they won't be people who have done the progression of that student. So they might have been an APR assessor, but not the progression assessor. It's sometimes that we draw on people who don't necessarily have a specialism and expertise in the subject area, but might have a methodological expertise. So I think sometimes there needs to be some thought about who might be the internal examiner at a much earlier point than who you think about who might be the external examiner, so that you make sure that your favourite or most useful internal examiner isn't used for the progression.
And there are other practicalities. I mean, it may be the person that you want is on sabbatical or not available or won't do it, or so there may be a B list of options anyhow, and that can take some time to work through, and that's why here we request the paperwork about 6 months before submission. So really the conversations need to occur a few months before that.
Yeah.
And the process is very exacting. I mean, your director of studies ultimately will make the nominations of the examiners, but they will need to be validated by your particular faculty, and that would involve CVs and a discussion and checks of experience, and it will also involve maybe looking at the relevancy of these particular nominated people to the project. So when that's approved, and there can be back and forth, only then does it go up to a university level committee where these the nomination form is re-examined and the case is made again. And they may request changes, they may decline, they may approve. We have a series of regulations, for example, how often can you be an external examiner here? If you've been a former member of staff, what's the gap before you can come back as an external examiner? Discussions of clashes of interests as well, and things like that. So in fact, the process is terribly exacting, because as you were saying, this is the highest form of discussion, the highest degree, and we therefore need to assemble with absolute assurance the quality examination team.
So to summarise, what would your tips be to students and supervisors nominating their examiners?
Start thinking about it early.
Yep.
And see if you can find out from other people whether they recommend an individual as an external examiner.
And my tip would be, if you can identify who they've examined before, have a look at the thesis. See how that thesis is written, what sort of things that they've considered to be of publishable, of doctoral level and quality, and the approaches that they've upheld, really.
Absolutely.
Okay, so thank you for listening. We hope that you enjoy our videos. If you do, please do click the subscribe button and you'll get updates of when we release new videos. If you've got any ideas of vlogs you'd like us to cover or questions you'd like us to answer, please do put the comments in the comment section below, and we'll pick those up and we'll try and do some vlogs around those areas too. So thank you and see you soon.
See you soon.
Bye.